The phone rings and the caller ID says IRS, Washington, D.C. The number looks familiar and looks legitimate. You pause, knowing that you've recently submitted your taxes. There could be an issue, so you answer. Pre-recorded message is played. This is the Internal Revenue Service calling about an issue with a recent payment. Please hold the line. After a few seconds, what you think is an agent joins the call. The agent claims your most recent payment bounced and they need payment now. Sounds far-fetched, doesn't it? But according to the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration, over 10,000 victims have collectively paid over $54 million because of phone scams since October 2013. Robocalls and falsifying caller ID are not just annoying, they have become the tools of scammers. This is the reason why regulators are taking such an interest in issue so seriously and so urgently. Before we get any further, what I'd like to do is cover some introductions. I'm Alan Percy. I'm the Senior Director of Product Marketing for TelcoBridges and today's event moderator. Joining us is Jim Dalton. He's the CEO of TransNexus. And Jim, thanks for being part of today's event.
Thanks, Alan.
So let's quick go over what we've got planned for today in today's session. I'm going to start with a closer look at the problem and learn how robocallers introduce fraudulent caller ID. We're going to take a quick overview of what the regulators are doing about the problem. We're going to learn about stir and shaken and how they prevent and detect fraudulent caller ID. And we're also, too, going to discuss and how we can help service providers implement stir shaken in their networks. And last but not least, of course, we'll address your Q&A questions. So first, we wanted to start with a little bit of a conversation about, the statement of the problem. And one of the key things was understanding, what the issues are with caller ID and with some of the robocalling. Well, first, a couple statistics here. One of them is that according to the New York Times article in May of 2018, there were 3.5 billion unwanted robocalls just in April of that month. The do not call lists, frankly, aren't working, and we're seeing, some side effects of that. We'll talk about that in a few slides. Also, too, the perpetrators are using this neighbor spoofing, a way of masking their identity and getting individuals to answer calls that they shouldn't. Also, too, some of the crowdsourced tools are creating false positives, and this is an issue where individuals get their numbers inadvertently added to the blacklist and therefore don't receive many of the important calls that they should be getting. So what is the problem and why has this become such an issue? Well, first of all, one of the big patterns that we're starting to see in the marketplace is that robocalls are causing churn in the marketplace because of unhappy customers. Essentially, robocallers, when they make their calls, they deliver their call into the originating telecom service provider, who then passes it along through a series of intermediate wholesale operators, eventually to the end customer's terminating service provider. When that call arrives to the end user, if they've showed up with a call during dinner time or when they're trying to do homework with the kids and it's nothing but Emily trying to sell you some credit card services, it only takes so many of these, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, that it becomes frustrating. You wonder, why do I have this landline phone at all? And this is what's driving a trend in individuals dropping their landlines. We're starting to see now retail switched access lines decline 12% per year as people begin to drop their landlines, mostly because it's just nothing but a way for people to robocall or to interrupt their dinner. Another issue is that, as I noted earlier, that scammers are starting to use robocalls and fake ID, caller ID, to create an impression to a fraud victim of some level of credibility. And the example that we gave earlier was just one of many of the scams. There's a whole long list here that Umail has collected, showing how many millions of fake calls for various scams, from the IRS scam that I talked about earlier, to credit cards, student loans, travel discounts, et cetera, even fake political campaigns. And all these do nothing but annoy customers, and unfortunately, in many cases, cause fraud situations where people lose good hard-earned money. A third problem is this calls being ignored. And this is where, an enterprise who has a very valid reason to reach their customers, it might be an example is, there might be a genuine problem with their credit card. It could be a school calling a home to let them know that there's been an issue at the school, or an emergency notification from a public entity. Those calls in many cases, either just get ignored because users don't recognize the telephone number and therefore don't answer the call, or using some of the call blocking services could inadvertently be blocked by blacklist or whitelist blocking, and then unfortunately then not getting these important calls. So they might miss doctor's appointments or learn about issues at their school. So this issue, there's a couple statistics on this too. Between 8 and 20% of enterprise contacts are failing to reach their destination. We're seeing a 20% decrease in answer rates for outbound call centers. That's really impacting their business and ability to reach their customers. And one statistic from Newsstore says that 25% of consumers, are missing important calls. And again, these could be from schools or from vendors that they should be hearing from. And all these collectively are showing a trend of the difficulty that's happening in the network. And of course, the carriers are starting to respond, and regulators have put together a strategy. And to talk about the regulators, I've asked Jim to take over and begin to talk about how the regulators are going to address this, and to begin to introduce the STIR/SHAKEN framework. So Jim, why don't you take it from here?
Great, Alan. Thanks. Yeah, for the regulators, this is a big, big issue. The FTC in the U.S. and the FCC, it is the #1 complaint they get from consumers. It has been for years. And we're not talking about a handful of complaints. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of complaints. So the regulators are definitely aware of this, that for their constituents, they're pushing telephone carriers to take action. And this has been developing for years. And there really been some significant things that have happened. I think one, really the first that came out in January this year is the Canadian regulator, CRTC. They basically made a decision that says that, Canadian telephone carriers need to implement secure caller ID by March 2019. And that's a decision, that's a mandate for all voice over IP calls. And there should be a progress report that's due in July of next month, basically on the status of that progress. So clearly it's happening, certainly in Canada. Just a couple of months ago, there was a bill introduced in the Senate, Robocallers, and Congress is getting involved. That basically requires a law that's been introduced to require telephone companies to verify caller ID. And importantly, the FCC has been marching down the same path as well. And they basically issued a timeline for a SHAKEN trust anchor to be in place by May 2019. That doesn't mean they're telling telephone companies to wait until then. They're urging telephone companies to go ahead and start implementing secure caller ID now. But the regulatory framework that really makes it work in a scalable, trusted way for all telephone providers is going to be in place in less than a year. And interesting, this is important. Verizon in an FCC filing just last month, they stated that they would be deploying SHAKEN this year and have most of it done in 2019. So things are definitely happening. It's starting to take place, and that's what's going on the regulatory front. So just let's go on and talk a little bit more. What is the solution? What is SHAKEN? And how do you stop these calls? It's a pretty simple idea. If you can verify that the calling numbers are authentic, then that's really all that's all the call party needs to know to decide, do they want to answer that telephone call or not? And at a high level, that's what this diagram indicates. So when a call, starting on the left side, when a telephone call is placed, it's really the originating telecom service provider's duty and expectation to authenticate, is this calling number legit? And if it is legit, then they should add a signature, a signal, attestation to the signaling that can be passed through all the way to the terminating service provider, so they can judge and pass on to their end users, is this a legitimate call or not? And when that happens, it gives the terminating telephone service provider to take actions on behalf of its customers. They can block bogus phone calls, Maybe they can divert those calls to voicemail, divert those to gateways that can filter out calls that are either going to be annoying or potentially scams, or they can pass the call directly on to the end user, giving them the information they need. Do they want to answer that call? And that's really what this is all about. And it's a really big enabling technology for telephone companies. So let's move on and just talk a little bit about it and where did this come from. So this all really began quickly, I'll just describe, with the Internet Engineering Task Force. That's the IETF. For years, they've had a standard in place called STIR, which is really about being able to verify the calling number authoritatively in a telephone call. And so this standard's been in place by the IETF, and what's important, which has been developed in the last couple of years, is really ATIS and the SIP forum taking that standard and defining a framework for how it should be used by all telephone service providers. And that's what shaking is. And that's a really important development because it gives a very clear way, a standard implementation that all telephone carriers can follow. So it assures interoperability. And that work has been completed for over a year, and that's what telephone companies are just now beginning to deploy. So how does this work? It's pretty simple, and it all begins, it uses digital signatures to ensure that calls can be verified, and you can be certain that when they're authenticated, you can verify them with certainty. And it begins with the originating service provider. And the first step is when they get the call info, they just make sure who is making this call. And based on who is making the call and the calling number, they can attest how much do I trust this customer. So if it's one of your subscribers and you've run Twisted Pair to that house, then you know that's one of my subscribers. I fully trust that telephone number. So you can give that telephone number an attestation level of A. You can absolutely trust the caller and the calling party for this telephone call. There are other attestation levels as well. Let's say the call is coming in from a trunk group. You know that you can trust that trunk group, but you're not sure exactly that calling number. You have the same level of confidence. So you give that a different attestation level of B. And then there are going to be cases where a call is coming in, let's say on a wholesale provider. You don't know anything about that calling number. And so all you can do is give it an attestation level of C, which means this call entered the network on my network. So it gives a way to trace back to that originating network where the call came from. Even though you don't trust it, at least you'll be able to trace back. So that's the first step, determine the call, authenticate the calling number, determine the attestation level. And then once you do that, digitally sign it with the private key. We'll talk a little bit more about this in the next few slides. So you create this call information, you digitally sign it with a private key, and that creates an identity header that you can have confidence in all the way to the end of the telephone call. And that gets added to the SIP invite that goes out to the called party. And so when the called party gets the call, they can verify. They will see in the SIP messaging, this call has been signed or the calling number has been signed because I can see the SIP identity header in the SIP invite. And so what the terminating network does, it takes that information and it takes the public key. It goes and gets the public key of the originating telephone service provider. And it uses that to verify the signature. And if there's a match, then they know, oh, this is a good call because I can verify the calling information using the public key of the originating telephone company. And they say, this is attestation level A. I can trust this calling number. This is a good call. And it's really that simple. That's how it works. So I'll get into a little bit more detail here of what the infrastructure is that actually makes this all happen. What are the network elements? So what you see there in the very middle of this slide is a certificate management service. That can be software or that can be a hosted service. And this isn't really new technology. It's been around for 2 decades, but it's finally being applied to the telephone network. And what that certificate management system does, that service, it's run by the originating and the terminating telephone providers, is it creates a public-private key pair. And that private key is really the secret ingredient that's used to sign telephone calls to make sure they're secure. It creates the digital signature. But who knows who a telephone company is? There are thousands of telephone companies, so you can't keep up with every telephone company. And that's where on the left side, you see the certificate authority. So this trust anchor is really, the certificate authorities are part of the trust anchor that really glue this all together. The certificate management system sends its certificate request to the certificate authority, and they create a public certificate. And that public certificate has the public key of the certificate management system. And that public key certificate is put into the certificate repository for anybody to get. And that is the public-private key cryptography that works, that makes this work together. You've got your private key in your network as an originating service provider. You don't let anybody see. You put that in your secure key store because it's the magic key that you use to sign your calls. And then the called parties who will verify those calls, they'll verify it using your public key that anybody can get in the certificate repository. So that is the complication there. It's not too hard. This goes on all the time in the internet today, in financial services, on websites. You're just not even aware it's going on. And it's not difficult to implement. So drilling down a little bit, what's going on in the service providers? So here we've got a telephone call. It's coming from a calling party. Could be a PBX, could be a handset, could be a mobile network, could be anything. But you've got someone's making a telephone call. And that call comes into a session border controller. And it could be a switch, it could be a session border controller, but we think session border controllers are going to be the most common element to implement shaken signatures for authentication and for verification. And in this example, the call comes into the session border controller. The session border controller sends a signal to its authentication service. And that's going to be coupled with the certificate management service that we saw earlier. You can see the secure key store. And that authentication service is where that originating service provider has provisioned their policies. For these telephone numbers, give them attestation level A. For calls that come on this trunk group, give them attestation B. Whatever it might be, there's so many different ways. There's a real richness of opportunities of developing new products regarding the security of these telephone calls. But the point is, in the call flow, is the session border controller asks the authentication service to authenticate this call. What's the attestation level? It does that. It returns information back to the session border controller. And what it sends back is a SIP token. And that SIP token is the information about that call, the calling number, the timestamp for the call number that the terminating party is going to use to verify this is a legitimate call. And it's been signed. It's the digital signature that keeps tampering, prevents tampering, and gives you the trust to trust that caller ID. And then the session border controller, after it adds the SIP identity header to the SIP invite, out the call goes to the called party. So just a quick look. I've talked about tokens and signatures. What all is this? This is a token. This is the identity token. This is what gets added to the wire. And at the very top, you see the X5U parameter in the header. There's the path to the certificate repository. That's where you go get whoever the originating customer is. That's where their public key is that you're going to use to verify this signature. And in this token, you can see it's got the calling number, it's got the timestamp of when this call took place, and it's got the called number. And when you match those to the invite, if it all lines up and the signature was valid, then you know you've got a good call. In this case, it's attestation level A. You know you can trust that call. Or maybe it comes in with attestation level C. You know you can't trust it, but you know where it came from. And an important element to look at is the very bottom here. See the orig ID? That's an important piece of this token. That's an opaque identifier that the originating network puts into this. You know, the originating network doesn't want to give you any insight to what their network is. But if there's anything that goes on, if the analytics engines want to look at this identity token, they can use this origination identifier to uniquely identify, hey, there's strange calls or the calls we don't understand come from this originating identifier. And now you've got your traceback information back to the originating service provider. You need to check on this origination ID. It seems strange. And that puts it all together. So you really have the complete trust information end to end, and the called party can be able to trust the telephone calls when they get it. And this is the token. And I've also mentioned the SIP identity header. This is what you'll see. If you use Wireshark, you're looking at a call. a SIP invite on the wire, this is what you'll see. This is going to be a new header in SIP invites. And in the gray text, that's the signature. That's basically the payload and the header information we saw before that has been digitally signed using the private key of the originating operator. And then you can see that header information in the bottom. So we've talked about how you authenticate a call in terms of being able to take the calling information and sign it. You put that on the wire, and now it comes to the terminating service provider. So here's an inbound call. It's coming into the terminating provider's session border controller. And again, we think the session border controllers is going to be the active network element primarily that's going to be used for this. The session border controller, it sees, I've got a SIP identity header in this invite. I need to check it out. I need to verify it. It could be verified on board, or it's probably could use a verification service, which again could be software or hosted solution. So it sends a SIP invite to the verification service, and it opens up. It gets the public key from the certificate repository. It looks in that, like we saw in the header earlier, finds out where's the public key. It goes and fetches that. And it uses that to verify the signature, and then it looks at the call information, the calling number, the call number, and the timestamp to see, does it match up? It matches what's an invite. This all looks good. I can trust this call. It's got an attestation level, A, B, or C, or whatever it might be. I know how to handle this call. And now that terminating provider can provide some policies of how they want to handle that call, where they want to block it, forward it, divert it, whatever their customers want to do. It really enriches what telephone customers can do on behalf, or rather what telephone companies can do on behalf of their customers. And the call gets completed to the call party based on those policies. So that's that's really what is going to make happy customers, because now, you know, the user experience, annoying phone calls are going to be blocked, they're going to be diverted, and you know, what are you going to see on your handset? So here are examples that New Star has published, and these are great examples of what users might expect. And so the first example on the left, you can see, you know, spam likely. And I think one thing that's going to be important, that's going to be standardized. You see that what really hadn't been standardized in the industry, but I think you'll see it coming, is that little lock with the red sign through it. I think that there'll be some kind of universal signal or icon that you kind of know, no matter who your service provider is, it's unambiguous. It's a call you want or you don't want. And the middle telephone, that's really example. You don't have to have a smartphone to be able to benefit from this. And I think what you'll see that terminating service providers, they're going to put a prefix to the calling name, to the caller ID, or replace it completely with information that tells you, you know, this is a suspect call, it's spam, whatever it might be. Again, giving the calling party what they need, you know, do I want to take this call? Yes, I do, or no, I don't. And, you know, on the right side, I think there's really a lot of potential that comes with this for businesses. You know, if they can get to their customers, project who they are with confidence, customers are going to answer those calls. And it's really those contact rates. For legitimate calls that you talked about earlier, they really need to be revived. And that's a big, big benefit that Shaken brings to telephone service providers. So I've got to put in one quick slide here that I think is important for everybody to understand. You know, I hear from some telephone companies, you know, we got a TDM network, we can't do it, it's going to be years, our vendor says they're going to adopt Shaken in 2025, and, you know, a million reasons why we're not going to do it. And I just want to make everybody out there aware, you know, it doesn't require a forklift upgrade of your TDM switches to deploy Shaken. You know, if you have an enterprise customer that says, you know, I want my calls signed because I want to have my call completion rates to go up, and you're getting some pressure that, you know, from your customers, they want you to support Shaken because they want their calls to hit the wire on the public network with attestation level A. You can do this for a pretty low investment pretty quickly. And basically, you put the calls that you trust on trusted trunks. And I've got those trunks from the TDM switch to the gateway, A, B, or C. So let's say you got calls from your class 5 switch. Those are trusted calls. You know, you can give those an attestation level A. You route that to a SIP, TDM-to-SIP gateway. You have that working in conjunction with the CMS and the Shaken authentication verification service. And now you can put those calls onto an IP network with networks that you can set up IP interconnects, and you can transmit that information about what the attestations levels are, A, B, or C. And now you've made your customer happy. You're providing that attestation level that's going to improve their call completion rates without having to upend and disrupt your TDM network. So I think it's important to realize I think there's a lot of misinformation that this is really a really big lift for networks to implement. And it is a change, but it's certainly getting started. It's not as difficult as it might sound. So about the benefits, you know, it's happy customers. We all know how aggravated we are with annoying phone calls of people getting ripped off of fraudulent calls. If you put an end to that, people are going to be happy, and that's the benefits. And it's not just for the call parties, it's not just for the customers, it's for telephone companies too. When you realize that your enterprise customers aren't pulling millions of dollars out of their telecom channel, you're going to be happy. It's a real benefit to telephone companies. So issues to consider. I won't get into all of these, but there's and there are also technical issues to consider. And I'll just quickly want to put up here, I don't want to make it sound overly complicated. I think what's important here is there is a real richness in new functionality. And that's an opportunity for carriers, for differentiation, for new products. And that's a good thing. There's a lot to think about. There's a lot to think about in terms of network design, but also in terms of product development and marketing. So, you know, TransNexus as well with our partner here, TelcoBridges, we can help you with these. And just as I wrap up here, just to clarify a little bit more about what we do. TransNexus, we develop software. We have software products that are ready to go with Shaken. And I'll mention in just a minute, we offer a workshop because it is early days trying to understand all those business and technical issues. We can help you. We've been working on this for over a year. We have some customers in early trials now. We've kind of learned what the issues are, working through all of these early deployments. And so we're happy to share that with individual companies to answer your questions, give a tutorial, learn about the standard, and also to work through your particular issues. So, Alan, let me just stop there and let you fill in the piece about TelcoBridges.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Jim. Well, you know, TelcoBridges since 2002 has provided networking equipment, you know, obviously specializing in immediate gateways, and more recently added a number of software solutions, including session border controllers with our FreeSBC offering that you saw earlier in the program. You know, the products are ready to go. We've done testing with TransNexus and this kind of SIP processing and kind of handling to be able to deliver the solution quickly and promptly. And, you know, in a nutshell, we have, you know, the expertise, not only for the immediate gateways, but also session border controller functionality to enable the stir shaken implementation on carrier networks. And Jim, I'm going to turn it back to you so you can give a little bit more detail about the workshop.
Yeah, sure. It's a one-day workshop. We'll come in, a couple of experts from TransNexus. We'll tell you all about the Shaken standard, but we'll do more than that. We'll tell you just, you know, what kind of the realizations we've had regarding the business implications, and be able to work through really what you need if you're considering an RFP, what do you want to ask for, if you're considering kind of architectural design questions. We've learned from kind of experience what some of the issues are there. And really, it's designed a one-day workshop to help a service provider kind of get up to speed quickly to start understanding what's going to be, what the challenge is, as well as opportunities. And Alan, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Yep, great.
So just to wrap up with that,
I will grab control back here real quick, and I think are we there yet? Let's just make sure I got this set right.
So Alan, I think I see your screen.
Okay. All right. So just a couple quick points. First of all, I wanted to add to Jim's got a landing page set up for the Shaken workshop. He's at discovershaken.com, discover-shaken.com if you'd like to register and learn more about the workshop. All right, so as product marketing manager for the FreeSBC, I would be remiss without spending just a moment to share what we've contributed to the solution here. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, our FreeSBC session border controller is a full function, capable software-based virtualization capable session border controller. It's a product of many years of work that came out of TelcoBridges' efforts in their media gateways, has broad compatibility across the networks, and it has a very unique business model being offered as a freemium, allowing those to use the software either for no cost without any support, or a pro version that allows them to use the software with a support. So there's a couple key differentiators between the free version and the professional version, and it mostly entails the support services that are included with it, and analytics and some APIs and OSS BSS connectors. So a broad, capable platform to build these kinds of solutions on. So with that, we're going to move to the Q&A session here. Looks like I got quite a few questions that have piled up here that we're going to jump to in just a moment. Before that, just a quick note. So, you know, if you'd like to pose a question, move your cursor in the upper left-hand corner. You'll find the Q&A panel will pop out, and you can enter your question there. And it looks like we got 10 of them. So let me get to our Q&A panel here. And these are some great questions too, Jim. I don't know if you've got a chance to peek at them in advance.
Yeah, I see them now.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, let's start with Russell asked a question about how it affects Class 4 telephony. You know, those wholesale carriers that are in the center. What happens to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really nothing. They need to make sure they pass the SIP identity header, and that's it.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. Great. Okay, James asked a question. What about CenturyLink and Windstream, and what's the time frame, or have they announced anything about adopting the service?
You know, I'm not aware of any public comments they've made on their plans.
Right. I think some service providers have. I think from Googling around, I think you can find some content. I know Cablevision, for example, and others have been participating in the standards development, so we're seeing traffic on that. So John asks a question. Sounds great, but depends entirely on the originating TSP to provide genuine authentication. What guarantees do we have that this will be done by all originating TSPs, especially cellular carriers? What about calls that originate outside the U.S.? And this is, I think this is probably the most powerful question. And I was going to pile on and ask, you know, what's to stop a spammer from buying telephone numbers in other geographies? And so this is probably a good question to address.
Yeah, for sure. So, gosh, so what do you do to guarantee that the originating TSPs are behaving properly and not missigning calls? You know, that's what's great about this. People can act badly, but they can quickly be found, and the FCC will act. So there are two things that you can't get away from this. You cannot. It's really there's no way to bogusly sign a telephone call, and here's why. Because everybody knows your certificate. You're going to validate it with the public certificate that you've gotten from a certificate authority, and it has the origination ID. And so the trace back is about 5 minutes. I mean, you know, as soon as you get it, it's pretty easy. So I think that, I mean, it makes enforcement very easy. So if there is a bad actor, they can be quickly identified and fined. And, you know, I think that's what we have lacked so far. There's no way to enforce all, you know, the regulations that are already there. There are plenty of laws in place. Do not call. I mean, it goes on and on. They can't be enforced. That's why this problem's got out of control. So what about calls that originate outside the U.S.? Yeah, that's where most of these doggone calls come from. And so if somebody, you know, you're in India and you're pumping calls over here, you're buying voice over IP access, and you know, you're going to put in calling numbers, whatever you want to look like the IRS. But it's going to take some carrier to put that onto the network. And if they don't sign the call, then it starts to penetrate. This shaken implementation penetrates the network. Those calls won't be signed. I think people are going to ignore them. So that's really, you know, it does require widespread adoption for this to work. And initially, it doesn't work until everybody does it. This is a chicken and egg problem, and that's why the regulators are pushing hard on this. You know, the FCC has not mandated. CRTC they have. FCC has not. but they're sending clear signals. If this doesn't take off by March 2019, the trust anchor's there, this could be mandated. They hadn't said that before. That, I mean, they have just about said it every way. It seems to me that you can say it without saying it. So it's just too big a problem. Too many people are being victims of crimes, and too many people are annoyed, and there are too many complaints. That the regulators, if not Congress, are going to force a solution if industry doesn't adopt it. That's my view.
Yeah, I think there's another element to it too, which is I think when you were talking about what happens to a call that arrives at a consumer that's not signed, it doesn't necessarily just even have to show up as caller ID. It can actually go to an application that the service provider offers that's a call screening application that could play a prompt, ask the caller to enter in a PIN code or a random 3-digit code. Much like some of the the current robocall stopping platforms do, and basically put those calls into the bit bucket before they even get to the consumer, if they're not signed. And then of course if there is a real human behind it, they could enter the PIN and the call will get through. But that requires a human to interact, and of course that's expensive, and that's what the deterrent is for these kinds of platforms. So yeah, it's I think, as you mentioned, it's dependent on widespread implementation, and there's certainly some very encouraging actions to get the service providers to cooperate in this, and basically save their own bacon. So, all right, let's move on then. So Russell asked a question about tandem calls, and I think I sort of answered that with the wholesale, the class 4 calls earlier, right? Or any changes?
Right. Yeah. So the tandem, they're just transit. It's fly across. I should say this: there is concern. SIP headers are getting bigger and bigger, and UDP gives you a limit of about 400 bytes, I guess, to put into a packet. And the shake and identity header is pretty big, and it starts getting you close to that UDP limit. And that's we're making, everything we've been doing so far is being UDP, and but I think the best practice has been encouraged for years. I think you're going to start to see transport move to TCP, which is a big change. It doesn't have to be that way. It's not required yet, but as headers grow, invites grow by other application systems, not the SIP identity header, that's going to be a new issue for transport providers to make the switch from UDP to TCP. But it's it's not a showstopper for the technology now, but it's something to think about, because invite messages are getting pretty big. Yep. But other than that, there shouldn't be an impact on tandem providers.
Okay. Then Sorrel, who he's got a flurry of great questions here. Thank you, Sorrel. What about, does it only work with the PSTN and SS7? What about over-the-top callers? And he sort of later asked a question about Skype and some of the other platforms. And how is that, which of these other non-traditional telephony applications are affected by this?
Yeah, so, the regulators are going to determine who can sign a telephone call. And obviously anybody can sign one technically, but to really make this work and to be able to be to be authorized and part of the trust anchor, in the U.S., you're going to have to be a phone company. You're going to have an OCN. And that is what you're accountable. You're accountable to the FCC. And the OTT guys, they're either going to have to strike a deal with their DID provider, whoever gives them numbers to sign on their behalf, or they're going to have to get their own numbers. And, reining the SIM from the Wild West is what's going to make this work. And I don't think that's onerous regulation. That's just a necessary fact of life to restore some trust to the public telephone network.
Right. Sorrel also asked a question about legislation forcing wholesalers and the CPaaS players to adopt this, and sort of that does open an interesting new topic, which is a lot of these robocalls are also coming from some of the CPaaS platforms, and the CPaaS platforms allow you very quickly to go in and literally with a handful of clicks provision a telephone number, and then you can start making automated calls, probably within a half an hour's time from signing up a new account. You know, has that been considered or thought through yet as to, you know, how they're going to provide a certificate? Is the CPaaS player going to be the one that owns the certificate, and he's going to be responsible for managing his subscribers to stop them with their terms of service, or have you thought that through yet?
Yeah, I think the people who have developed this stir and the shaken framework, they've definitely thought that through. And so somebody's got a communication platform as a service. If they're not a phone company, they're not going to be able to get a certificate that can be used to sign a telephone call. So the trust anchor that I mentioned that FCC is putting in place, you have to go get approval from a policy administrator, and you have to get certificates from an approved certificate authority. So it can't just be anybody. It's got to be, you know, a telephone company that's approved, and then you need to get your certificate authorities from a certificate authority that's approved by a policy administrator, or the FCC. These are all private entities. It's not the government, but the FCC has oversight over these private entities regarding how they behave. So yeah, you can't just go to Twilio and start pumping signed telephone calls with signatures that people are going to verify.
Right.
And I missed a part of Sorrell's question. It works on everything we've discussed requires SIP signaling, and there is really, you know, there are proposals and ideas of how to do this over SS7, but it just doesn't really seem practical. So
right.
Everything requires a SIP infrastructure.
Okay. So yeah, so Sorrell also asked a question about what about SMS? Has this been thought about or been applied relative to messaging applications instead of voice calls?
Oh, that's interesting. I've never thought about it, never heard it discussed. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Maybe. I'm just not aware of it.
Yep.
Makes sense.
And let's see. So let's move on to Jay. Has there been interest in large enterprises, more than 10,000 SIP endpoints, and implementing this on the originating end? So this might be, you know, large enterprises that are making high volume of outbound calls, or I guess.
You know, yeah. So that's a good question. I think there are enterprises out there who are screaming for this. You know, I don't know if you know some of those slides. You pointed out the stats from Numerical. Their business is actually trying to get enterprise numbers out of the analytics engines that have been put in there mistakenly, because some Robocaller has spoofed a good number for Walmart or some big enterprise like that, and now when they try to make a telephone call, it's getting blocked because it's been spoofed by a Robocaller, and it's driving the big enterprises crazy. Their call completion rates are going down, and they are absolutely asking for a solution. Yep. And that's on the origination side. On the termination side, the financial services, what they fight every day on bogus telephone calls is I think they really are demanding some kind of integrity to the telephone network, because I mean, they're on the front lines of facing you know, social engineering, people getting in and fooling them. So I think the demand from enterprises is a lot greater than individuals complaining to the FCC in terms of real dollars that will impact telephone companies.
I feel their pain because someone spoofed my cell phone number a while ago, and I, for 3 days straight, got people calling me back saying, I missed a call from you. Who is this? And I had to break the news to them that no, it was a robocaller. They spoofed my number. Sorry. And thank God they moved on and used somebody else's number. But anyway, good question here from Guntram. From what calls per second performance are you expecting from the authentication verification service?
Let's see. What calls per second are you expecting? Oh, I think that's I think it'll be high. I mean, this will scale up. I mean, the authentication process, you have to sign, and so that's somewhat resource intensive. I think verification is a really easy function. I think every SBC is going to have verification just built in.
Right.
That's just a simple feature. And So, that's a good question. There is a load on, signing all these calls. It can be offboarded from the signaling platform. I don't see that as a major implementation. I haven't heard any concerns about what that load is going to be. Interesting enough, here's the thing I kind of didn't talk about that's unique about these certificates. What's different about Shaken, and this is kind of a real difference, is these certificates are short-lived. They're going to be created every 5 minutes, and that's really different from the way most certificates are used today. Usually they last a year or maybe longer. And that's a new load that we're not used to. Now, that's not for every call, but you do need certificates every 5 minutes, a new certificate every 5 minutes. And it's going to be interesting to see how the CAs price that. They're clearly going to be a whole lot cheaper than what they charge for certificates today. But there's a really great reason for do that. You don't need certificate revocation lists. And if somebody compromises your private key and they start, faking that they are you because they got your private key and can sign calls for your signature, and they can only do it for 5 minutes because then that certificate is obsolete.
Right.
So that's kind of a new load that people are wondering what's it going to be like to create certificates that often. But it's from what we see, we think it's completely manageable. It's not it's not going to be an implementation.
Sure. We had another question from Elias. I think, again, you answered this one already. Well, in the intermediate network, what's the responsibility of the intermediate to wholesale networks? And I think you answered it already before, which is they're not involved necessarily. They just have to be able to pass the large SIP headers as they traverse their networks. It's only the originating and terminating networks that need to.
Yeah, I think the practical implementation challenge, they need to make sure they pass the SIP identity header.
Right.
It's a new header they haven't seen before. They can't throw it away. They got to pass it.
And then Calvin asked a question, is this going to push the service providers to TCP instead of UDP?
Yeah, I think that's it's more it's just more. It adds bulk to the SIP invite, which starts moving you to that limit. And it's definitely a step in that direction. Is it the sole culprit to make that happen? No, but it definitely makes the invite larger. So, like I say, today we're doing it over UDP. We think the best practice is go TCP, and that's what the industry will move to. And there are good reasons to go to TCP anyway, for just fraud and denial of service reasons. But it's definitely a step in that direction.
Right. So another question here. This is from Anonymous. If they're a hosted PBX or hosted contact center solution with a variety of carriers, who attests to the service provider that their individual carriers that the call goes through. Oh, all right. Yes, basically, I can see the point is, so if you're a hosted provider, you got a hosted PBX or hosted contact center, and your customers are making calls. Who attests to the ownership of the numbers that they're using. And I think, based on what you said earlier, that the service provider is going to be the one, the actual carrier is the one who's going to attest that they handed that number over to one of their customers. If the customer misuses the number, well, then the carrier is the one that's responsible for enforcing that misbehavior, correct?
Yeah, Alan, I think you're right on all of that. And this really, it's a very good question. And it's a little, I feel like it's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but I'll just touch on it because it's a really important topic. Here's the classic situation. For this, I think this question's linked to your call center. You've got telephone numbers. You make telephone calls on schools, pharmacies, all kinds of people. You've got, and you want to make those outbound calls on behalf of those customers using their calling number so people will call them back. And you've got multiple telephone providers. So you're a call center making telephone calls with calling numbers that don't belong to the vendors you use to put that number out on the public network. So who signs those calls? There is a mechanism that has been developed by the standards body. It's called a proof of possession certificate. And basically for those calls, your call center, you're going to make this is a telephone number from service provider A. my telephone service provider B, they're not going to sign this call. But there's a mechanism where you can go get a proof of possession certificate in an automated way from service provider A. I'm not using you, service provider A, to originate my call, but I want you to give me the ability to sign it. So when I send it to service provider B, they'll trust, okay, I trust the enterprise, and they got permission from the telephone carrier gave them this numbers of DID to use and to sign. I'll do it on their behalf, and I'll send it on. So it's that's really kind of a workshop issue. That's a little too much to get into now, but it's a great question. And
yeah, that was a good question. Okay, so let's move on here a little bit more. Neil asks a question: if call leaves a TDM switch and a TDM trunk, where would the call be signed?
and so
Sounds like it broke up a little bit.
Alan, can you? Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah. There you go. Okay. All right. There's another question here. Neil asks: if a call leaves a TDM switch and a TDM trunk group, where's the call get signed?
Yeah. That was that slide I had in there. If you got a TDM switch, there's really no way to sign it. You have to get it onto some kind of SIP infrastructure. And if you send it to this TDM-to-SIP gateway, then that SIP gateway can interface with a authentication service to get the SIP identity header, the signed SIP identity header, added to the SIP invite for that one.
Right. Right. Okay, so a couple questions here about SS7 from Ron. Is Stir Shaking going to be integrated into the SS7 network? And it kind of reinforcing also says, since SS7 does all the call setup in the TDM world.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I'd never say never. It just seems to be, like I said, there's really no really compelling solution that's been worked through with the standard bodies yet. There are people doing some work. I don't know of a solution for the TDM world, how that would work. So I won't say it'll never happen, but there's not one available now.
Okay. And then one last one, and looks like we're running out of time here. We're running up to the top of the hour here. I want to wrap this up. So Luke asks, what about the refer method, and where does that fit in? If any
that's
insight on
I have to think a little bit about that for refer.
Probably like call transfers, right? So if a call arrives to their endpoint and they say, nope, don't need it or can't handle it, need to forward it off to somebody else, and they're going to refer it. So that's going to go back into the network and redirect it. Is this authentication header going to survive the refer or transfer? I guess is probably a way to put it. I think that's what he's getting at.
And certainly if a call is forwarded, the diversion number is added to the payload of the SIP identity. And I'm just trying to think of what's in a refer message, and that invite it goes out from a refer message, and I just don't remember the details in that case.
Right.
But every case has to be handled, and for sure there can't be any gaps or holes. And so I don't have an answer on that, but I feel pretty confident that it'll be addressed.
Well, I will tell you one thing, Jim. You've done really, really well with Stump the Expert today.
So, thanks, Alan.
All right, so we're almost at the top of the hour, so I'm going to wrap it up here. And I appreciate everyone. His great questions, and it was some 21 questions that we got, and phenomenal. And one of the things we are going to do is we'll collect all the rest of your questions. We'll type them up, and we're going to put them up on the FreeSBC wiki that we maintain all the Q&A from our webinars, and that'll be included in the email that's sent to you as a follow-up with the link to the recording and some other materials. So like that, I'd like to thank Jim for sharing some of his experience with our audience and spending some time with us today. And as I noted in the opening housekeeping, you will receive this email hopefully by the end of tomorrow, and that should have everything, including the recording and the links to the other materials. So with that, I'm going to say thanks everyone for listening in today, and one last thanks to Jim. You've done an outstanding job today, and looking forward to working with you on the workshop as we go forward.
Great. Likewise, Alan. Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.